Rascal Chapter 8, December, January, February. The first flurry of snow came early in December, whirling a few flakes into Rascal's hollow in the tree. I feared that a real blizzard might make that den quite uncomfortable. From a piece of sheet copper, I fashioned a hood over the entrance, and I lined the hole itself with old blankets and an outgrown sweater of mine so that my raccoon would have a snug winter nest. Rascal took an immediate fancy to the sweater, perhaps associating it with me. As cold weather set in, Rascal grew sleepy. Raccoons do not actually hibernate, but they do sleep for many days at a time, emerging only occasionally to pad around in the snow seeking a full meal. Every morning before I left for school, I would go into the cage and reach into the hole. I wanted to make sure that Rascal was safe and comfortable. It was a great satisfaction to feel his warm, furry body breathing slowly and rhythmically, and to know that he was sleeping soundly in his pleasant home. Sometimes he stirred when I petted him and murmured in his sleep. Now and then he awoke sufficiently to poke his little black masked face out of the hole to look at me. I always rewarded him with a handful of pecans. I realized, of course, that our partial separation was only temporary. Many living things sleep through the winter. My woodchucks under the barn, frogs deep in the mud, seeds in their pods, and butterflies in their cocoons. They were merely resting for spring and would awake again with a great burst of new life. Rascal and I would have wonderful times together when the warm months returned. So with a final pat or two, I would tell my pet to go on sleeping, and Rascal, drowsy-eyed, would curl into a ball and return to his winter slumbers. My financial problems increased when we approached Christmas. In recent autumns, I had earned as much as $75 trapping muskrats. This allowed me to purchase thoughtful gifts for the family. But since signing my peace treaty with the muskrats and other wild animals, I was finding that peace does not always bring prosperity. I solicited nearby neighbors and shoveled many walks, earning a top price of 50 cents for moving a couple of tons of snow. I also increased my efforts to sell more Saturday evening posts, but the silver accumulated very slowly, and prices were frightfully high in the stores. A handsomely illustrated fishing book, which I wanted to buy for Herschel, was marked $5, and fur-lined gloves for my father would be nearly as expensive. Then there were gifts to be purchased for my two sisters and small things for my pets. At this rate, I would never be able to save enough to buy the canvas for my canoe. One Saturday, after a discouraging tour of the stores, I stopped at the post office to find two cheerful letters in our box. One was the first from Herschel since the armistice. The other was from my beloved sister Jessica, still taking postgraduate work at the University of Chicago. Both letters relieved my mind in a number of ways. Herschel had survived the war and influenza. He said the Paris garters I had sent were better than a rabbit's foot. No metal had touched him. War censorship had been lifted, and for the first time my brother was able to tell us where his outfit had been fighting. His single paragraph, listing some of the bloodiest battles of the war, was so quietly factual that it might have been the report of a pleasure tour. We spent a couple of months in the hot Marne region and then went to the Alsace sector. Later we joined the Chateau Thierry offensive, the these French words are hard to say, Oise offensive, and the Meuse Argonne. We were on the Meuse at the time of the armistice. I apologize, the French words are quite challenging. Then came the disappointing news that he had been ordered to march to the Rhine to help establish a bridge near Koblenz, Germany, and that he would not be demobilized for 6 months at the earliest. He asked us not to send gifts, saying he would bring his presents with him when he came home. My first reaction was sadness that Herschel would not be with us at Christmas. I had heard nothing concerning an army of occupation and had not realized that demobilization is such a slow process. But at least he was alive and unwounded, and I would have a few more months to scrape together the money for the fishing book. Letters from Jessica were always a joy. Bright, salty, and affectionate, they told so much concerning her unselfish character. Flashes of temper were to be expected, but they were outweighed by the gaiety and Spartan good humor of this sister who had cared for my father and myself for so many months after my mother died. Jessica was coming home for Christmas. She enclosed a $10 check made out in my name to help me with my Christmas shopping. I was very fortunate to have a brother like Herschel and two sisters like Theo and Jessica. With my financial crisis eased, I turned to the pleasant task of buying a tree and sweeping and decorating the house. My father paid little attention to such matters, and furthermore, he was again away on business. Almost immediately, I realized that Rascal presented a new and difficult problem. It had always been our custom to invite some of the animals to be with us on Christmas Eve when we distributed the gifts. In the past, we usually had limited the 4-footed delegation to Wowzer and the best behaved of the cats. But it was unthinkable to exclude Rascal, who, however, could never discipline his hands when shiny objects were within reach. He could examine a glass paperweight or lift the lid of the sugar bowl without breaking glass or crockery. But I could well imagine the damage he might do to the fragile glass balls and figurines on the Christmas tree. How could we have both Rascal and a Christmas tree, and yet we must have both? The answer to this dilemma struck me as a real inspiration. There was a large semicircular bay extending from the living room, with 6 windows that overlooked the flower garden. This was where we always mounted our Christmas tree. I bought and decorated a thick spruce, which tapered gracefully to the star at its tip and nearly filled the bay with its fragrant greenery. This took me most of one Saturday. Then I made careful measurements of the rectangular opening leading to the bay and hastened to my work bench in the barn. I had sufficient chicken wire left from building the cage to cover a frame designed carefully and precisely to fit the opening I had just measured. In less than an hour, I was maneuvering this construction through the big, double front door into the living room. The lumber was white and new, the chicken wire shining, but for a few moments I hesitated before nailing it to the unmarred woodwork of our respectable old house. Still, it required but one nail at each corner of the frame, and I could fill the holes later with putty or wood filler. Another few minutes and the job was complete, and there, safe behind the wire, was the decorated tree, every bauble secure from my raccoon. I put a Christmas wreath above the fireplace, laced Christmas ribbons through the ribs of my canoe frame, hung a few sprigs of holly from archways and chandeliers, and stood back to admire the total effect. I was immoderately pleased with my work and could scarcely wait to show it to my father and to Jessica. When my father returned from his trip, I led him happily into the living room and pointed to the Christmas tree, wired off from the rest of the world as though it might try to escape its native forest. "My word," my father said mildly, "what are you building, Sterling? Another cage for Rascal?" "You're warm," I said. "It's not that it's so that Rascal can't climb the tree and spoil the ornaments." "Well," my father hesitated, "at least it's unusual. Do you think Jessica will hit the ceiling?" "She might," my father said. "You never can tell what Jessica might do." There was one train a day from Chicago, an old 10-wheeler pulling a baggage car, a passenger coach, and sometimes a freight car and a caboose. We loved that train and listened for it to rumble across the river bridge, blow 4 times for the lower crossing, and come huffing and puffing up the slight grade to the station. My late grandfather had often spoken of the first train that had ever rolled over these tracks, with 20 yoke of oxen helping it up the grade. But ours was a better and much newer engine. There seemed to be a special music to the bell of our 10-wheeler, and a special corona made by its exhaust steam as it pulled to a halt and hissed its hot vapor into the sunlight. Train time was exciting, even if the passenger coach did not carry someone as much loved as my sister Jessica. The conductor helped her down the steps, and my father and I took her suitcase and her many packages. She was wearing a wide-brimmed velvet hat, which looked very fashionable, a new coat with a fur collar, and high-laced shoes that came to the hem of her dress. She had recently sold several groups of poems and a short story, and she seemed quite affluent. "Merry Christmas, Jessica! Welcome home!" we cried. She kissed us, and then held me off and looked at me critically. "You've outgrown your mackinaw, Sterling, and you'll catch your death of cold not wearing a cap." "He never wears a cap," my father explained. Obviously, I was clean and had combed my stubborn curls into some semblance of order, so Jessica wasn't altogether disapproving. We went homeward through the iron-cold air and bright sunlight, up Fulton Street, past all the stores, We turned right on Albion past the Carnegie Public Library and the Methodist Church, then left on Roland Street, and there we were, still laughing and chattering and asking 100 questions in the manner of most families gathering for Christmas. Perhaps we were extra gay to cover an underlying sadness. My mother would not be at the gracious double door to greet us. Herschel was still in France, but alive and unwounded, as we kept repeating. Theo and her kind husband, Norman, would be spending Christmas in their own home far to the north. Already our closely knit family was dwindling and dispersing, as all families eventually must. But the three of us would do the best we could to bring cheer to the old house. As we entered the living room, I wasn't sure whether Jessica wanted to laugh or cry. I had done my best in decorating the tree and the canoe, which was supposed to hold our cargo of gifts, but suddenly I saw it through my sister's eyes. An unfinished boat, chicken wire, and dust on the furniture. "You simply can't go on living like this," she said. "You must hire a full-time housekeeper." "But Dottie," I pleaded, using her pet name, "I worked so hard on the tree and decorations and the cage to keep Rascal out." Then Jessica was laughing and hugging me in the crazy way she often acted, much the way I acted too. She was, and is, the most spontaneously affectionate, thoughtful, brilliant, and unreasonable sister one could wish for, a very attractive combination I have always maintained. "At least we can take the canoe to the barn," Jessica said, not wishing to lose her advantage. "But, Dottie, I can't take it to the barn. It's cold as blazes out there. I have to put on the canvas first." "We'll put on the canvas, and we'll still have time to clean this room for Christmas." "That sounds sensible," my father agreed. "But you don't understand," I explained. "I had to spend all my money to build the cage, and then all the other money I could scrape together to buy Christmas presents, and—" "Sterling, get to the point," Jessica said. "So I haven't any money left for canvas, and it will cost about $15, I think." Jessica looked at my father severely, and he said, "Now, be reasonable, Jessica. I'm a busy man. I can't know everything that's going on in Sterling's head, and I didn't know he needed money for canvas." Jessica sighed, realizing that we were both quite hopeless and greatly in need of her care. "Well, at least I can cook you some decent meals and clean up this house." "It's perfectly clean," I protested. "I swept every single room and shook out the throw rugs and scoured the bathrooms. You don't know how hard I worked getting this place beautiful for you. And besides, we like our own cooking, and we don't want a housekeeper. You sound like Theo." "We're happy," my father said, "as happy as we can be since your mother died." "Don't be sentimental," Jessica said fiercely, wiping tears from her own eyes. "You just wait until I get on an apron. And another thing, you're not going to have a housekeeper whether you like it or not." "Oh, you're going to have a housekeeper whether you like it or not." On the day before Christmas, we wrapped our gifts in secrecy in various rooms of the house, camouflaging some in odd-sized packages. We arranged them according to the recipient, those for my father in the prow of the canoe, those for Jessica in the stern, and those for me amidships. After an early dinner, we brought in the animals, Rascal first to allow him to wake up for the festivities, then Wowzer, and finally the selected cats. Jessica immediately fell in love with my raccoon, and when she saw how he struggled to reach through the wire to touch the Christmas tree baubles, she forgave me for building the barricade. The Yule log was blazing in the fireplace, shedding light on the tree and its ornaments, and making the chicken wire gleam like a dew-drenched cobweb. The argosy of brightly wrapped gifts greatly intrigued my raccoon. Animals, like children, find it difficult to wait for a gift which is almost within reach, so we always gave them their presents first. Each cat received a catnip mouse, making the old Toms and Tabbies as playful as kittens, and causing a certain amount of possessive growling. For Wowzer, confined to his bath towel on the hearth, I had a new collar which Garth Shadwick had fashioned. But for my pampered pet Rascal, I had only Christmas candies and pecans, being unable to think of a single other thing he might need. In opening the family packages, we proceeded in rotation. This gave us a chance to admire each object and to express gratitude. There were many thoughtfully chosen books, ties, socks, warm gloves, scarves, all appreciated. The best gifts came last. Theo and Norman had been quite extravagant. They had sent Jessica a fur muff and my father a shaved beaver cap. To me, they had given shoe ice skates, very rare in our region in those days. I eagerly awaited our next game of hockey. My father brought forth from his pocket a small buckskin pouch and poured into his hand 7 beautifully cut and polished agates. They were ringed like Rascal's tail, from golden yellow through oak leaf brown to deep maroon. With unexpected forethought, he had sent our best rough stones from Lake Superior to a gem-cutting firm in Chicago, insisting that they be returned in time for Christmas. My father was pleased by our response. He chose 3 agates for Jessica and 3 for me. Then he did a most surprising thing. Calling for Rascal, he handed him the handsome little stone that the raccoon himself had found. Always fascinated by shining objects, Rascal felt it carefully, sat up, holding it between his hands to examine it and smell it, then carried it to the corner where he kept his pennies and unceremoniously dropped it among his other treasures. He came back chirring cheerfully. This might well have topped the gift-giving, but one more large package still lay amidships. To Sterling from Jessica. I was very curious, but could not imagine what it might be. Upon removing the wrappings, I found an unbelievable present. Enough heavy, strong, white canvas to cover my entire canoe. I was near to unwanted tears, but Jessica saved the day. Now perhaps we can get this canoe out of the living room, she said. Wowzer, Rascal, and the cats were soon asleep around us. My father asked Jessica to read from the 2nd chapter of St. Luke, as Mother had done on so many Christmas Eves. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus, and she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and they were sore afraid. Faintly through the drifting snow came the strains of the church organs playing Silent Night, Holy Night. We put out all the pets except my raccoon, the cats to curl in the hay of the barn, Wowzer to sleep in his double-walled doghouse on his blankets, but Rascal went to bed with me. As we dropped off to sleep, I wondered if at midnight raccoons speak as other animals are said to do. It is good to remember that I was given those swift and shining skates early enough in my life so that I could use them for 3 happy winters. By the 4th winter, I was in a wheelchair, and even when I learned to walk, I was never able to skate again. At 12, however, I could skate all day, play hockey for hours, and cut simple figures on the ice. It is the nearest thing to flying which man has achieved, or so it seems in memory. I had taught Rascal to be a living coonskin hat. He would take a firm grip on my ruck of curly hair, brace his strong hind paws on the collar of my mackinaw, and enjoy the wildest rides he had ever experienced as we glided forward and backward over Colton's ice pond just south of the railroad tracks. Slammy Stillman, who had weak ankles as well as a weak brain, came to Colton's pond one day, clamped on his skates, and came wobbling into the gay throng. Rascal and I saw a chance for well-deserved revenge. Without so much as touching the town bully, we rushed him and turned on a dime, throwing shaved ice in his unhandsome face. He went down screaming, "Mad Coon! Mad Coon! I'll teach you a lesson!" But the jeering laughter of 50 boys and girls must still be ringing in his ears. He never gave either of us another moment of trouble. The wall telephone in the living room rang insistently through the echoing reaches of our house at 2 a.m. on a foggy morning in February. I leapt from bed to answer. The voice that came booming over the wire was that of my Uncle Fred. "Is your father there?" "He's asleep upstairs." "Well, wake him up, Sterling. It's case weather." "Case weather?" I shouted with excitement. "I'll wake him, and we'll be out there in less than an hour if we can start the Oldsmobile." "Okay, son. May I bring Rascal?" There was a good-natured chuckle at the other end. "Sure, fetch him along. We'll need all the extra hands we can rally." "Case weather, Daddy," I shouted up the curving stairway. "Uncle Fred needs us right away." I lit a fire in the kitchen stove, prepared a pot of coffee and a skillet of eggs, and hurried to wake Rascal. He came to the kitchen blinking like a sleepy owl. It certainly was case weather, fog so thick you could cut it with a knife. By the time we had eaten, started the car, and driven beyond the streetlights of the town, we wondered if we would be able to follow the icy ruts. Lamplight glimmered from the windows of almost every farmhouse. Lanterns, and hollowed by the fog, bobbed along the path leading to the tobacco sheds. Case weather, usually a sudden February thaw, softened the tobacco leaves, making it possible to handle them without damage. The warm, moist atmosphere might blanket the region for only a few hours or for several days. During that unpredictable interval, every load loaded with tobacco plants must be taken from the drying sheds and piled in the stripping house, there to be covered with canvas to keep the moist leaves from freezing. It was back-breaking labor at breakneck speed, but filled with a desperate sort of excitement, a sporting event on which each tobacco farmer was betting his whole year's crop. We expected Uncle Fred to call us at any time of the day or night when case weather began, and the number of automobiles and buggies groping their way through the fog showed that many others from Brailsford Junction were on a similar mission. The chains were on the car all winter, and we were very grateful for the added traction as we slithered through slush and mud, but we safely reached the old homestead at last. Without stopping at the lamp-lighted kitchen where Aunt Lily was undoubtedly preparing an early feast, we hurried to the largest tobacco shed where Uncle Fred and my 3 cousins were already high among the beams, handling down the pungent, pliable tobacco. Rascal and I scrambled swiftly to the rafters to take our place in that human elevator. The raccoon was slightly bewildered by the new name, but he loved excitement and was content to perch nearby. The raccoon was slightly bewildered by this new game, but he loved excitement and was content to perch nearby, his eyes green gold in the lantern light. He must have thought we were slightly insane in a harmless sort of way. I worked hard and fast on those high beams for nearly an hour, but I was no match for my father, and certainly unable to compete with Uncle Fred and his 3 husky boys. True, the lasts of tobacco plants were not as heavy as they had been during the harvesting, but they were heavy enough as I balanced among the rafters, trying to maintain my equilibrium. I let one loaf of tobacco slip. It fell 30 feet to the floor, missing by inches the men below me. This was my first intimation that I was becoming tired, and my father said quietly, "Sterling, you'd better take your raccoon and go in to see Aunt Lily." I felt ashamed to have dropped the tobacco, and to have proved again that I was not fully capable of doing a grown man's work. But to drop another lath might mean an injury to someone below. So taking Rascal and one of the lanterns, I made my way up the slope to the kitchen door. Aunt Lily hugged me, stroked the raccoon, and said, "We shouldn't have called you at 2 a.m. Come have some coffee and hot muffins." "I love case weather," I said, "and your muffins are wonderful." I gave a bite to Rascal, who immediately begged for more. "I'm glad you came in to visit with me, Sterling. How are my men folks doing?" "We've taken down 4 tiers at one end," I said, "maybe a quarter of the crop, but I dropped a lath, Aunt Lily." "Well, you're just a little boy," Aunt Lily said. "I'm not a little boy anymore," I protested. "I'm 12 years old, and I weigh nearly 100 pounds. With Rascal on my shoulder, I weigh 111. "You're both growing up," Aunt Lily said sadly. "I don't like to see things change, children growing up, their parents growing old." "You're not old, Aunt Lily." "I'm 47. "That was the age of my mother," I said. "Will she be 47 forever, Aunt Lily?" Aunt Lily failed to answer for a moment, and then she asked me if I wouldn't like more muffins and coffee. We sat quietly for a time, each thinking his own thoughts. "Well, Sterling," Aunt Lily said finally, "I suppose you'll eventually be going to college to learn a profession and to make something of yourself. We take it for granted going to college. Your Uncle Fred will never send our boys, or even let them earn their way through school." There was no bitterness in her voice. She stated this tragedy as a matter of fact that could not be altered. I understood the situation more completely than she realized. Uncle Fred was the only uncle on either side of my family who had left college before graduation. I'd heard him say that he didn't want any of his boys to get this superior notion that they knew more than he did. Aunt Lily undoubtedly thought life on the old farm was heaven, but I was beginning to see lines of worry on her face. Now, what profession have you chosen? I haven't thought about it very much, Aunt Lily, but perhaps I'll be a doctor. Oh, no, Sterling, you couldn't be a doctor. You're too tender-hearted. I helped Dr. McChesney once when he... I knew she was remembering the crushed arm of a hired man who had caught his hand in the ensilage cutter. The arm had been amputated on the kitchen table, and Aunt Lily had administered the chloroform. No, perhaps I couldn't be a doctor. I think I know what your mother would have wished, Aunt Lily said, and she looked so much like my mother as she said it that I wondered to whom I was talking in the lamplight of this fog-enshrouded world. I listened as though it were indeed my mother speaking. I think she would have wanted you to be a writer. A writer? And then you could put it all down, Aunt Lily said. The way it is now, case weather, the fog, the lantern light, and the voices of the men. Hear them coming in for breakfast? You could keep it just like this forever.